What is a road? If you ask this question to different people, you may get various answers, but almost all of them include one word specifically: car. And that's not an accident. This is the calculated result of one of the largest corporate propaganda campaigns to ever occur on US soil. A campaign that quite literally spilled blood in the streets. Because, well, they were fighting for the streets themselves. After all, the future of the automobile hung in the balance. Billions of dollars. A future that could not risk being jeopardized. And all it would take was to wage a war. A war against pedestrians. The first constructed road was built by the Mesopotamians in 4000 BC, and the first car, known as the motor wagon, was invented in 1866, meaning roads have existed for nearly 6,000 years before the invention of the car. And this begs the question, what were roads before the automobile? With our modern perspective, we would be tempted to think there was something along the lines of freeways for horses and carriages, but you'd be wrong. Roads were not designated for any mode of transportation in particular. They were for everybody. Everyone had their own right of way, which meant that all travelers on the road were equal and no law could give precedence to one over the other. And roads themselves had no laws attached to them because, well, there was no need. Children would use them as places to play games with one another, and people on horseback or in carriages would simply work around them. And due to the limitations of speed on horseback, if there was a problem, it could be negotiated on the fly between people riding and those on foot. If two riders came to the same intersection, they would quickly hash out who would go before one another. In fact, this type of social negotiation was the primary skill set for traveling at that time. And you might be wondering, if there were no rules, what were police officers doing? Well, in regards to roads, they would simply help hash out these negotiations if they happened to create a problem or went unresolved. There were no road laws for them to enforce, so they simply helped to guide people, as streets were a common place for everybody. Let me emphasize, there was no distinction between riders and pedestrians. They all belonged and were simply traveling to where they needed to go. If anyone was harmed in an accident, such as being trampled by a horse or a carriage, the rider was nearly always at fault, because since the road was a commonplace, the person they ran over had the right to be there and thus was presumed innocent. Not to mention, the slow speeds of horse-drawn carriages gave drivers plenty of time to stop, swerve, or communicate to the person in front of them before the accident occurred. To quote a newspaper from the pre-automotive age, it was every man for himself. The only general rule of the road, if you could call it that, was an unspoken one. Depending on where you lived in the world, mostly if you were in a British colony or not, you either kept to the left or to the right side of the road. This was the way that roads functioned and operated since their inception, a beautiful equilibrium in which everyone belonged, but not for long. The first automobile was invented by Carl Benz in 1886. It strongly resembled a horse carriage or even a bicycle, but it was powered by a motor and could go approximately 10 miles per hour, faster than the typical 4-mile-per-hour pace of a horse-drawn carriage. However, this first rendition was just a prototype of what was to come. After a few years had passed, more cars were made, and people all across the globe experienced the awe of witnessing an automobile for the first time in their life. You can only imagine the awe and sheer spectacle of people lining the street to catch a glimpse of one of these passing by. The loud noise of the motor and the smell of gasoline permeating the air. But after the first few times, the novelty started to wear off. By 1900, cars started to be capable of speeds that disrupted the equilibrium that existed since the road's inception. The issue with these fast speeds is that they allow for less time to communicate with others on the road, which opens the window to mistakes and car accidents to occur. This especially became the case once cars started to be enclosed, which put another barrier between drivers and those around them. Additionally, it goes without saying that fast speeds also allowed for less time to react to people walking in the street, who, let me remind you, had the full right to do so. And the issue that the speed of the automobile created became abundantly clear once bodies started to stack up in the streets. In 1900, 36 Americans died in motor accidents. In 1903, it was over 100. 6 years later, it crossed 1,000. 2 years after that, 2,000. And in 1918, the year the First World War ended, the number of motor fatalities reached over 10,000. And since Armistice Day, over the next 4 years, more Americans had died in car accidents than they did from combat in France. That statistic was sobering, and it was a bombshell that spread to nearly every corner of the United States. This was a huge problem. Almost all unanimously agreed that a new menace lurked in the streets of America: the automobile. The issue with these statistics was that in populated places, over 2/3 of these deaths were pedestrians, and a disproportionate half of them were children. To add insult to injury, before the 1920s, the only people who could afford cars were at minimum upper class. So the optics of the situation were really bad. Basically, it was a bunch of rich people killing children in the streets. And yes, I use the word killing because the drivers were almost immediately deemed guilty no matter what. By customs, pedestrians held unrestricted rights to the streets, and therefore questions about where a pedestrian crossed the street or how alert to traffic conditions they were completely irrelevant. Most American police would have agreed with the statement released by the Ontario authorities, who regarded pedestrians as victims of, quote, an unfortunate attitude of mind which belonged to some drivers and which assumes that the pedestrian should get out of the way of the vehicle. Even in trials, juries tended to favor pedestrians as well by giving, quote, the pedestrian the benefit of the doubt. A safety expert explained that the policy of the average juryman is to make the automobile owner pay, irrespective of responsibility for the particular incident. Through this sentiment, the American populace started to disdain motorists with a passion. It wasn't uncommon for enraged mobs to form after car accidents. Early city traffic campaigns were in large part funerals to the dead, featuring ceremonies and monolithic monuments with the names of those who passed inscribed on them. In Detroit, school teachers or police officers read off the names of the dead and how they died to school children, and a bell rang out over the city every time another traffic fatality occurred. Suddenly, a motoring Grim Reaper started to rival Uncle Sam for dominance of America's newspapers. And if it wasn't the Grim Reaper driving, the car itself was made out to be a demon or a monster, the origin of the word speed demon, a phrase used as a slur against motorists. Another such phrase was joyrider, which spawned from the common sense idea that cars were, after all, unnecessary. Society functioned completely fine before their existence, and suddenly a bunch of rich people want to buy these needless machines and start killing children. And then they have the gall to demand for the order of the street to change around their novel automobile. Another thing was that driver and vehicle weren't clearly distinguished either, and nor were the responsible and irresponsible drivers. They were all simply clumped into one group. They also believed that cars, like guns, were inherently dangerous and gave drivers, quote, gasoline madness or gasoline rabies, and they also called them speed maniacs. The phrase joyrider reinforced the idea that motorists rode for joys and thrills instead of necessity, which made their case for killing so many pedestrians even worse. On the flip side, walking was obviously necessary, and pedestrians were virtually incapable of causing harm to others from simply being on their feet. So to many, it seemed quite obvious who was in the wrong. Meanwhile, while all of this was happening, law enforcement and the government were scrambling to find ways to rein in automobiles and make the streets safer for everyone involved. All the way back in 1903, New York instituted its very first traffic code. As cars spread to more and more places, the code was used as a reference for how other cities shaped their own. But no one knew what was the best way to do things. After all, there was no body of work or history to adopt from. Lacking any tested theory or empirical research, the laboratory turned out to be the street itself, and the method would simply be trial and error. The result was a patchwork system of differing laws all across the country, each trying its own little experiment for how to solve the car problem. Some cities even gave right-of-way to horse-drawn vehicles over automobiles. In 1923, a committee of investigators remarked that, quote, If we were to collect specimens of traffic control devices from those cities where traffic regulation is active, we could fill a museum with signs and signals, no two of which would be alike in color, shape, size, or marking. This is also why when talking about various traffic laws and the story of automobiles in general on this video, the dates will be all over the place. It is simply impossible to make things chronological when telling the story due to the nature of the history itself. It's also important to note that police officers did not see traffic congestion as an issue. Since it slowed down traffic to pre-automotive levels, they actually saw it as extremely useful. In their eyes, it restored the order that once had been. In this same vein, police made speed limits that were always extremely low. The median state-designated speed limit in cities in 1906 was 10 miles per hour, and local authorities usually could and often did set lower limits. In some cases, it was illegal to drive a car unless a person with a flag raised walked in front of it. No, I am not joking. But the thing was, the increasing number of traffic laws needed to be enforced by an increasing number of police officers. And at this time, nothing was automated. For example, before World War I, it was common for policemen to manually turn a stop-and-go sign to regulate traffic at intersections. For this reason, the Michigan city of Grand Rapids found itself spending more than 36% of its police budget on traffic regulation at intersections alone, the place where around 70% of all car accidents occurred. And this was not an uncommon figure for police budgets at the time. Additionally, officers complained that the complexity of traffic codes made them difficult to enforce to begin with. In 1921, motorists could be found complaining that rules could suddenly change, literally from intersection to intersection with no indication whatsoever. But some uniform rules and forms of automation were starting to ease these issues. Around the mid-1910s, for the first time, many cities installed similar physical objects to control traffic on the street. Not only did this alleviate the police need to enforce everything themselves, but it also alleviated drivers of the burden of needing to memorize all of the traffic code. Instead, they could just follow the physical indicators. One that started to catch popularity was a painted line that marked lanes in the street. And another was called the silent policeman, a metal pole about the size of a fire hydrant that was erected in the center of intersections. Now, I know that might sound strange, but a priority at the time was teaching drivers to make wide left turns in order to prevent car accidents. The silent policeman acted as a visual cue that forced drivers to do just that. They were also favored because drivers were forced to slow down significantly in order to accomplish these turns, and as mentioned earlier, policemen really like that. But after a decade or so, the silent policeman started to be done away with because it was increasingly deemed a street hazard in more and more locations, and the cost of needing to continually replace damaged ones started to significantly add up. Instead, they were replaced by the equivalent of a small circular speed bump that was a lot harder to destroy. It was called the mushroom. And in 1914, we actually saw the first practical use of traffic lights in Cleveland, Ohio. For the next decade, they were still very unusual and rare sights to find, and were limited to busy streets and big cities. In the beginning, they were operated by a policeman sitting in a booth at the intersections. Full automation would only start to appear later in the 30s and 40s. But still, this was an advancement since busy streets often required more than one officer to properly police. Now, it was a one-man job. As America's lawmakers were experimenting and starting to find a modicum of success, and its public mourning the losses of tens of thousands in automobile accidents, there's one group that has been left untouched in the story thus far. And you might have been wondering, where the hell was the automotive industry in all of this? Simply put, they were planning a war. To start off, the companies that manufactured cars fully understood that as long as automobiles were 1. Considered unnecessary pleasure cars for joyriders, 2. Their death toll consisted mostly of children, and 3. The blame for accidents was always automatically placed on the driver, the future of the automobile in the country was cloudy at best. And to exacerbate these issues, there was even public outcry to call for the formation of an anti-automobile league. Additionally, the police and the government's efforts to slow down the car to pre-automotive speeds would crush their sales, since, well, the primary reason for buying a car was to go faster than horse-drawn carriages to begin with. All things pointed to one single factor: the pedestrian. As long as pedestrians remained the kings of the street, the automobile would continue to have a high death toll and be forced to go extremely slow, leading to a downfall in sales and causing it to die out, and things would simply revert to the old way of life. Essentially, there was no possibility of a peaceful coexistence between automobiles and pedestrians. It was either one or the other. And for the automotive industry to win, it would need to require them to completely reconstruct what a street is and has been since its very inception. They would need to convince everybody that the streets are made for vehicles to run upon. The first step was to popularize and propagate a negative phrase or slur for pedestrians. Quickly, the word jaywalker caught on like wildfire. Originally, a jay was a hayseed, out of place in a city. Jaywalkers were people who did not know how to walk in cities. In the beginning, they applied mostly to pedestrians who obstructed the path of other pedestrians. But for obvious reasons, motorists who saw themselves as a persecuted minority, by the way, started to adopt this phrase as their own. By 1916, police had started to use this term commonly to pedestrians who ignored their directions. But until 1920, it was still a relatively rare and, most importantly, controversial term. Obviously, many pedestrians did not take kindly to the phrase, as it sneakily implied that the streets were no longer for them. One Brooklyn man put it best, quote, "The pedestrian as an American citizen naturally resents any intrusion upon his prior constitutional rights." This was now also a battle of freedoms. The freedom for the pedestrian to walk or for the motorist to drive. Around 1915, cities started to mark crosswalks with painted lines, specific places for pedestrians to cross the street, but most people simply ignored their existence. This continued on for the next 5 years, and by that point, around 1920, police were on board with preventing jaywalking, but they knew that they could not simply arrest everyone who did it. Firstly, there would be too many offenders to control, and secondly, it was such a minor offense that it would spark civil unrest if people went to jail for it. So instead of harsh and direct enforcement, they reframed it through the perspective of safety education and used public shaming to get the message across instead. As one automotive representative put it, public safety is a product which has to be sold to the public. And this was precisely what they did. In cities across the United States, Boy Scouts started to hand out cards to people who crossed streets in disapproving ways. The cards explained what a jaywalker was and usually were accompanied with making the case that the practice, to draw from an actual card handed out back then, was, quote, permissible when traffic was horse-drawn, but today it's dangerous. Conditions have changed. This mass distribution of anti-jaywalking cards is when the term became mainstream and then far less controversial. Parades hired actors to demonstrate what jaywalking was to spectators. The same year, the Washington Post fired back, arguing that, quote, the Jay driver was an even greater menace to society, but to no avail. In 1924, the jaywalker had officially entered the American dictionary, accompanied by a new motor age definition: one who crosses the street without observing the traffic regulations for pedestrians. Still, many pedestrians continued to cross the streets however they pleased, but by 1930 most agreed that such people, when obstructing vehicles, were jaywalkers. But this did not all magically happen. Behind the scenes, all of this was because a new player came on the block in the early 20s. Before then, automakers were scattered competitors who wanted absolutely nothing to do with one another. But soon they realized that if they continued to compete with each other, they would not be able to fight the biggest killer of all, public opinion. So they started to bridge alliances that would give them political power and social influence. In one word, this corporate group of overlapping interests would come to be called motordom. Now, you may have found it odd that it was Boy Scouts who were used to distribute anti-jaywalking propaganda. but that was on purpose. As with any propaganda campaign, children are the easiest targets. By the mid-1910s, before Motordom was even properly formed, automotive companies started to sponsor school safety campaigns. Since children were primarily affected by car accidents, this was an easy sell. But what they taught the children was to respect the car's right of way so that they didn't get hurt. They flipped the responsibility from driver to the child before their very eyes. For children who could not even remember a time before automobiles existed, it seemed logical. So by the time Boy Scouts were handing out automotive propaganda, they fully believed it themselves and were now trying to convert adults to their new framework of thinking. Despite this, in the early 20s, children's deaths were still continuing to increase. Nearly half of the children struck were on their home block, meaning that they were likely playing in the street, which has served as playgrounds for kids ever since they became a thing. Actual playgrounds built for children's play were very rare and inaccessible to most, so the obvious solution was to simply build them everywhere. To have a playground accessible somewhere nearby for every child in the country. This movement got some serious traction in 1922, and the effects could be felt almost immediately. Once playgrounds were erected across the country, it caused a mass withdrawal of children from the streets, and the child casualty rate dropped. As adults began to constitute a larger proportion of the dead, the innocence of the automobile's victims grew less obvious. It became harder to make the moral drama of the trifecta that threatened the future of the automobile. And next on the list for Motordom was to fix the issue of blame for the accidents always being automatically placed on the driver. Now, the gradual reframing of pedestrians having some responsibility over their own safety helped this cause, and additionally the propagation of traffic rules was also good for this, since if more rules were there, the less guilty the driver seemed when he gets in an accident without breaking them. But there was still one key component missing, and that was shifting the stereotype of all drivers being maniacs to just a select few irresponsible drivers in the group as a whole. To accomplish this, Motordom pushed a concept that had already been tested in some states, the driver's license. If people needed to pass a test to acquire a license to drive, and bad drivers could have their license revoked for bad behavior, you could no longer call all automobile drivers reckless. So past 1924, Motordom fully backed the adoption of driver's licenses across the country. They went so far with this idea of blaming traffic fatalities on a small group of bad drivers that they created a competition with a $25 gold reward for whoever came up with the best equivalent of a jaywalker for driving. The winning suggestion was, and I am not kidding, Sliverboob, which obviously never caught on. Either way, they had now succeeded in their job. Drivers as a whole were no longer labeled as reckless, at least in the newspapers, which, by the way, Motordom now also controlled. Before, journalists would draw conclusions of guilt in car accidents from police officers or witnesses on the scene, and the results, as previously mentioned, almost always framed the driver as guilty. In response to this, Motordom launched a central accident news service in order to, quote, make sure the reporter gets the records and the essential facts. So for any news surrounding car accidents, they would be the de facto source that journalists would go to. Essentially, Motordom now owned a monopoly on car accident reporting, and along with their reports, they would offer totally unbiased advice for accident prevention. The results could be seen within months. Anyone who carefully read newspapers would notice how suddenly, quote, it is now the fashion to ascribe 70 to 90% of all accidents to jaywalking. In addition to all of this, pedestrians and even children by the late 20s could be considered under the law reckless. Thus, good drivers who got in accidents were no longer automatically guilty in the eyes of the public. So now, the only thing left to prove was that the car is a necessary aspect of daily life. One of the biggest factors in helping this claim would be the affordability of cars. Fords went for as low as $400 or just over $7,000 today by the 1920s. In 1922, future US President Herbert Hoover stated, "One cannot condemn the automobile as a prerequisite of the rich." And then he added the nail in the coffin. The automobile is no longer a luxury, it is a complete necessity. This last statement was a grand achievement for Motordom. And considering that the man who said these things would soon be the president of the country, it's safe to say that that speech marked the beginning of the end for the future of pedestrians in the United States. A future that would simply be a downward spiral of a self-fulfilling prophecy of making cars more and more necessary to the point to where it was impossible to live without them, to make streets less and less accessible to pedestrians, first starting by making pedestrian paths in the form of overpasses and sidewalks, and then culminating in creating the first road that fully excluded them. Highway number 1, resulting in many cities which are quite literally impossible to traverse on foot. The car was now truly a necessity. Now, I won't lie, when I first set out to research this video, I was simply curious about how the rules of the road came to be. You know, basic things we take for granted like traffic lights, street signs, etc. The kinds of things I cover on this channel. But what I found went much deeper than I could have ever imagined, and it became the story I just told you, the much forgotten war against pedestrians. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.